Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have Tornado Nate, and you are kind of a tornado, at least on Twitter. You're all over the place. You're weaving in and out of conversations. I have to say, I really like your style, man. It's a good
Thanks.
vibe. I think that you're really constructive in online discussions. I think you have a lot of really interesting things to say, and I really enjoy your presence in kind of DO Twitter. So, welcome. Now you're
Thanks.
on the podcast as a single guest. You've been on a couple panels. Now you're a single guest. Rising.
Well, nice. It's great to be here. You know, it was totally surprising to me. Because I got on. Well, I had this Twitter account from like 2012. I got on it just to mess around with it, and then I never used it. And I wasn't really very interested in it. Was wasting my life using Facebook. And then like 9 months ago or so, I started playing with it more. And I intended to, because I was, I do some other things around psychedelics. I do a podcast, Altered States of Context on Psychedelics, which is more focused on the clinical side of it.
Yeah.
I kind of occasionally write a newsletter as well about that same topic. And so I was, more there to engage with that. And then I just started, I don't remember who exactly, but I think I, ended up in the orbit, following you and following Ashley and kind of getting hooked into DO. And I was like, well, this is just awesome. And so I just kind of totally did a complete unexpected turn into that, because it's way more fun. And I think that was what, in my online interactions, it's like, well, I want it to be fun. Mm-hmm. And often we'll get into it later, but often the psychedelic conversation online is not very fun. Yeah. But the Doomer Optimism, it's always a good time. And I try to keep it that way. And if it's not fun, I'm like, I got to get out of here. It needs to be fun. If it's online, like there's no point in. Yeah. I can think of maybe a couple times where I found myself getting like really frustrated, but overall, keep it fun.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed is you're really good at, like, there's some particularly cantankerous people online. I'm not going to name names, but that'll get really mad at you and just kind of go after you. And you seem to be able to kind of joke and poke and kind of, mix it up with people that you don't really agree with, who, other people might be actually even afraid to even mix it up with them because of the blowback. And you seem to just handle it with grace. Like you seem to get away with it. And I think it's because your good intentions, like it's your sincerity is coming through. And so I think that it diffuses what would be kind of like, these explosive arguments.
Well, I hope so. I've done my time as a keyboard warrior and trying to prove a point and shit like this. And I don't care. I think that's part of what goes, that part of what drives that is that I don't care. It's cool. It's Twitter, disagree. Like, it doesn't affect me if you disagree, it doesn't yeah. I don't need to prove anything to anybody on Twitter. Right. And so it's just really like, you got to keep, I really got to keep my ego out of it, because who cares? There's nothing to prove. Yeah. Somebody, we disagree at the beginning of the conversation, we could disagree at the end. It can either be informative, because I've had some of those conversations that have really like helped me, because I do want to understand. That's the other part that really drives me is, and I think that, I'm curious about people. My job as a psychotherapist, and I'm not sitting there trying to analyze. I think it's the stereotype is analyze and figure out. I just want to understand, like, people are fascinating. Yeah. And I want to understand how people's lives are and how they see the world. And hopefully that can understand or inform, I should say, how I see the world.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the other thing about these interactions and kind of the what I had is I don't want to say a revelation, but not at all revelation, but definitely a change of heart, like in the last year, which is really just like, this ain't working, and I'm willing to entertain any ideas at this point. Like the way I was looking at the world, and the way, like, I don't care. I'm open. I'm open to be convinced of stuff. I have strong feelings and strong opinions. I care about things a lot, but I'm willing to be wrong.
You use the term strong values, but ideologies loosely held.
That's the ideal.
Are those
I think that's the ideal.
Are values and ideologies, how separable are they? Like how much,
I believe that they are almost completely separable. I think they're almost completely.
But do the values have to be so vague, like the golden rule, or, just like these very vague that everybody can kind of apply their own interpretation to and agree with, right? Or like what kind of values are we talking about here? Like how specific values? Like for example, I know that you got into the abortion debate with folks, and that's a pretty clear line, right? It's a battle between bodily autonomy and the belief that life begins at conception, right? And there's really it's hard to find middle ground, and values. You can say, oh, that's just ideology, but is it? It's also, it is values. It's are you prioritizing, when you believe human life starts, or are you prioritizing bodily autonomy, right? Yeah.
There are values conflicts. Certainly, there are values conflicts. But I'll say that I think that, value essentially is like, this is what I love. This is what I love. That's in a nutshell. What I love, what I would defend, what I really care about. Okay. And that's sort of pre-ideology, in my view. It's pre-ideology. It's not something that you're constructing. Now, you might verbally construct it if you're trying to describe it to somebody, but the value is almost pre-verbal. It's down there deep. It's not, once it becomes verbalized, and I think, then it does have the edge of ideology, because to me, that's what ideology is. It's when you verbally conceptualize a system of thought of any sort. And I often come across as anti-ideology, and I guess I come across that way because I more or less completely am, but it's not useless. And we have to use words, we have to describe things, we have to construct systems. But that phrase, holding it loosely, I think is what's, for me, important. Right. And then there are going to be, at times, irreconcilable values conflicts, right? I think abortion is one of those, where it's I do kind of think it's irreconcilable. It's one of those really hard, painful things to talk about, right? Like it's unpleasant because, you're dealing with like very strong feelings and very strong judgments in either direction. And it becomes so incredibly divisive. So it's a very painful thing to talk about, but yeah, I don't know what else to say about that one.
Yeah, well, let's back up.
I don't know we're going to solve the abortion debate here.
No, that's not my intention at all. So let's back out. Let's if you can give a quick recap, narrativize your life a little bit. And we all know that when we do that, it comes out different each time, and we emphasize different things each time. That's fine. So narrativize your life a little bit. You're a psychotherapist. You're really interested in the transformative power of psychedelics. You do regenerative ranching with cows. You're a Grateful Dead head. Let's string some of these together a little bit.
I did say that was my only ideological commitment, is right. Primacy of the dead. I'll stand by that one. Yeah, I will die on that hill. But so, yeah, I'll just. But it's how you construct that is an interesting thing. So I'll weave in the psychedelic part right from the start, and we'll go back to. My experience in undergrad, which was uncomfortably long ago at this point, 25 years ago. And, I was, as you might gather, I guess, describing the tornado, I was pretty wild for a while there. Went to college, was kind of carried away. I had, in high school, I'd had a DUI. I drank way too much. Like, I was a partier, and I was pretty intensely, borderline out of control. But, I was like this privileged college kid. So I was just there having a good time and whatnot. But really, it was clearly having a negative effect on my life, and looked to be having a much more negative effect on my life. Mm-hmm. But that's what I was doing. I was in college and I was partying, and I don't want to say, and I don't want to trivialize like a lot of struggles that people have with substance abuse. But I did for a while use the word alcoholic for myself. I don't know if I use that word to describe myself anymore, but I did for a time. Mm-hmm. But around around the middle of college at some point, because I was just kind of doing whatever, right? And so somebody had some mushrooms, and I was like, sure, let's do those. And I took these mushrooms, and it was like, whoa, that was different. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really different. That's not like getting fucked up. That's not what I thought they would be. Like, it was super interesting. Mm-hmm. Like, it was this super interesting experience. And I wanted to do it again because I'm like, that was fascinating. And so over about the next 18 months, I did that more, and I drank less, to the point in which I completely stopped drinking. Through a few experiences I kind of had these real clear experiences. And I'd switched during that time from doing mushrooms to mostly doing, LSD. Basically the janitor at the place I lived was like, well, hey, if you like those mushrooms, you're going to really love this stuff. And I was like, okay. And he was right. I did. And, had some experiences that just really kind of like, in my mind, I was like, wow, I could see very clearly, like, this is what I care about. This is where my life is going if I keep, on the path I'm on. So I need to get off that path. And just like that, this thing that I had been struggling with, because I was struggling with it, I was like, really, like, I need to stop, but I can't stop. Like, this whole thing, I just stopped drinking completely. I was like, this is really not who I want to be. Like, it was just so clear and so easy. Yeah. I don't want to be this person. I don't want to be this guy. This is not a way to live. But I did keep using the psychedelics for, for a while. I remember my junior year in particular, I had stopped drinking at this point, and I was just, and I also completely buckled down on school and became like a real, like a good student. I mean, I've always been a pretty good student, but I really was focused on that. And then every weekend I had a few friends, and this sort of developed spontaneously. This ritualistic use developed spontaneously. And every weekend, Saturday morning, we'd we'd go work out, do some homework. And then towards the evening, we'd drop acid and do our thing. And progressively over the course of about 2 or 3 months, we did it every single weekend like this. And it kind of culminated in this experience that is described as, in the research literature, as like these mystical experiences. In the religious literature, it's this experience of unity or oneness. I remember clearly we were camping down in southern Missouri. It was Johnson Shut-In State Park, and I remember walking into a clearing because I was just kind of wandering around, and looked up at the sky, and it was one of those perfect nights, where there's not a cloud in the sky and the stars just seem like they're dropping out of the sky on you. And I looked up, and I immediately fell on my knees, and started weeping, and I didn't exactly have the words for it, still don't, but I remember sort of saying afterwards, I felt like I had the answer to every question that I'd ever asked, all the things that had made me, just maddened and worried and consternated and everything just made sense in that moment. Like,
was the answer
existence,
42?
everything made sense.
Was the answer 42?
Pardon?
Was the answer 42?
That number did not pop in, but
Wrong answer.
But it was remarkable, right? It was just a remarkable experience. And after that, it really kind of loosened up. Like I didn't use as much anymore, kind of progressively less, tapering off to very occasional, because it really felt like it was building to that. And then once that happened, it was like, there's not much more. I mean, not that I don't think there's much more to learn, because I'm not one of those, when Alan Watts said, when you get the message, hang up the phone, like, well, that's done. I've never felt that way about it, even though I think I did go about 10 years once without using it. But to me, I want that line. That line is always open in my mind if I ever need to pick it up. I always think that there's more to learn. Just there's not an urgency, or there's not. It really felt like an experience that was building towards something. And so, that happened, and then of course my life was in a completely different trajectory by the time this was all done. I was doing better in school, and I was really motivated. I ended up meeting my wife, who she worked in the dean's office, and the dean of students had actively warned her against me. But she was like, yeah, I don't, you understand, he's changed, he's different now. And I had, and so we got together and decided to move out to Colorado, and that was sort of the next thing we did.
Nice. How long ago was that?
We moved to Colorado in it was after she graduated, because I hung around for another year. I graduated in 2000 and had planned to move to Colorado, but then I was really into this girl. And so I decided to hang around, and she graduated a year later. And after she graduated, so like June, I think, of 2001, we moved, because it was right before 9/11. And then we got married the following year. And then we were in Colorado. I did some wilderness therapy stuff out there, because I was really, I wanted to then, I was really interested in transformative effect of psychedelics, but transformation generally. And I've always been an outdoors person. I grew up in the country in Southern Illinois, in the woods, and loved the outdoors. I grew up camping and doing all that. And so, connecting people with nature was like, for me, like that's nature. You get out in nature. That's a great way to kind of make that sort of direct connection with the world. Which I guess you could really, I think that's a theme or a summary element for sure, is like a direct connection to the world, and be that through connection with a place, connection, with land, connection with each other, just like these direct connective experiences. And so I did some wilderness therapy stuff out there, and got really into fly fishing, and did the Colorado mountain thing a lot. Emily went to graduate school at Naropa, and then I went to graduate school to become a psychotherapist at Naropa as well, and studied transpersonal counseling psychology, which is like counseling psychology that has a transpersonal, specifically works in the transpersonal element, which is the sort of it's a word essentially meaning is the spiritual part of being a person, not just the material aspect of psychology, but also a spiritual aspect as well.
Were you into Integral? I know Integral was big in Boulder.
It was, Ken Wilber is from Boulder, and it was very big, and it never really did it for me. It was just a little, I don't mean to disparage it, but it always felt to me a little too eggheadish. Maybe I just,
all of these
head kind of looks like an egg. So
like, was it that they were just kind of too abstract and kind of schematic rather than the actual process of,
I think that's exactly, I think exactly. So it felt just a little too tedious.
But that's not the experiential side. Was it the map? It's not the territory thing?
Yeah. Very, very much so. It felt too abstract, too yeah, tedious I didn't connect with it. And then got a job and, kind of earned my license and things like that. And that's about the time we decided to have kids. Also weaving into this is then, in 2009, well, backing up a little bit further, my parents were kind of like pseudo hippies, like online I talk about hippies a lot. They're like pseudo, like they both grew up in that time and were very influenced by hippie values, but they, had jobs and didn't drop out and do all that. So they weren't, I would never say they were like all the way hippies, but they, I grew up with, organic food, bulk food bought from a co-op, giant things of peanut butter, whole wheat bread.
So you guys were trad then. Isn't that what the trads do? I've heard about that. I thought that was a right wing thing.
No, it was at the time that was
confused.
It's confusing because it has completely, it's disorienting really, because at the time that was just hippies. It was just hippies. Yeah. It was no, hairy armpits and the whole thing. Like it was just hippies. So I like the food thing was, when we moved to Colorado, they had Fort Collins had this amazing food co-op that I loved. And so I was really into this food thing. And then in 2009, Michael Pollan wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma. And I read that book and it it was just like really hit me hard. Like, it was like this book, like it grabbed me. And it was all because it was like it wasn't a lot of things that were brand new. It was just brought in so much because I'd already read, The Botany of Desire. I was a fan of his before.
And now he's reading a psychedelic book. This guy must be your favorite author.
Well, Wendell Berry is my favorite author, but Michael Pollan's probably number two. Like I really have.
But Wendell Berry hasn't written about psychedelics, man. You can't.
He hasn't written about them.
You can't just Pollan like that.
He hasn't written about them, but he's
core areas.
But side note, Wendell Berry was extremely close, lifelong friends with Ken Kesey, who was the original Merry Prankster, the originator of the acid tests, which was ground zero for the Grateful Dead, ground zero for the Flower Children, the Haight-Ashbury scene, the whole thing.
Right. Okay.
And they were cohorts. Wendell and Ken were cohorts in a program at Stanford and had remained lifelong friends. So that piece of information I find.
I accept that explanation. Proceed. Go ahead.
Wendell's never acknowledged anything publicly, of course. And I think there's maybe a wink there somewhere, but to me, I'm like, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, I read.
Hey, you. Sorry to get you off track. Go ahead.
No, not at all. Not at all. Pollan's book was about food, right? It was about food and our food systems. And that's when I think the decision started to be made. It took a long time. It was very hard because we loved Colorado. I still love Colorado. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful place to live. I love trout. I love to catch trout. It's just a wonderful place. But we have family here in Illinois, and we have Emily's grandmother has the farm that we're now on. And it was deserted, and it was being rented to a tenant, and pretty degraded, pretty run down. No one lived here, and it was just sitting here. And so reading that book, thinking about the possibilities of what that could be, thinking about being closer to our family. We were blessed in that, both Emily and I have wonderful relationships with our family. We didn't move 1,000 miles away because we didn't get along with our family. Colorado seemed like a fun adventure. Yeah. But then we had kids, and it felt really bad to keep them that far away from their grandparents when they had these loving grandparents that wanted to be in their lives. So we kind of made that. When Quinn was born in 2008, this book in 2009 really hit me. And then the decision started to be, but it took a long time to transition. And then in 2012, we just kind of hit that point where it's like, we're either going to do this or not. We just need to go. So we packed a U-Haul and just like we just came here. It was 10 years ago, last week, 2 weeks ago.
Wow. Okay. All right. So we're starting to get up to the present. Anything else you want before we dig into some things? Anything else you want to get us caught up with in these last 10 years?
That's the last 10 years have been, you can kind of see some of the things I share on Twitter. There's been a lot of learning. It's been pretty hard. It's pretty hard to renovate a big old farm. You had
an awesome thread. I remember a long time ago. It was one of the first things I saw from you on the account of like homesteading mistakes. And I think that was like pretty viral thread. And yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to be transparent about that. Like, it's like, well, I mean, it's just honest, it's like everything, you go on Instagram and you see all the home and it's all this shiny, happy stuff. And it's like, I love it. I love my life here. So I'm not saying that it isn't that, but it isn't only that. It's a lot of difficulty and it's a lot of hard, and it's a lot of failure and a lot of frustration and a lot of not enough time. And so there's all these, all these difficulties. And yeah, that thread was just sort of like, I just walked around and took pictures of, well, there was this thing I tried 6 years ago and that failed. And now here's the remnants of it. Here's another thing I tried and that didn't work. And here's another thing. Cause it was, there's a lot of those, and some of them have worked and I think we're putting it together, but, it's been a lot of learning over the last 10 years. And, of course we're raising kids. Our kids are now 14 and 11. And, as you know, that takes a lot. So it's been a pretty intense decade since we moved back. I mean, pretty darn intense. I didn't have a job, and so we homeschool. And so I moved back and immediately within 3 months, I needed to make a full-time income because we didn't have much of a cushion. That is what I meant. We just had to like do it. If we don't do it now, we're not going to do it. And so we just came and I opened up my counseling practice and got full pretty quick and it worked. So it's kind of just a whirlwind. Still is, I'm now in the process of really, really wishing I could slow things down a bit. And that's sort of where I'm at right now in my life, is trying to like, whoa, how do we slow some things down, focus a little bit more? Because there's been a lot of intensity for sure.
When did you read your first Wendell Berry book?
When I moved here. I had exposure to him before because that was another seed. If you have seeds of like the move here was in, I don't know, it was 2006 or something. I'm not, maybe before, but whatever. There was a sustainable living fair in Fort Collins, Colorado. And a speaker there was Wes Jackson. And he talked about perennial agriculture. And that was a few years before the Michael Pollan book. But it was also like it was a seed that was really germinating there. I was like, wow, that's it made complete sense. What he talked about made complete sense to me. And he's good friends with Wendell Berry and talked about Wendell Berry. And I was like, oh, okay, that's a guy I've got to read, but I didn't get around to it.
Yeah.
And when I moved back, that's when I dove in, and I dove in head first. And I read, some of his essays and stuff like that, but it's really his novels I connected with. And I read all of them. I've read all the Port William novels and stories, in this sort of hope attempt just to understand, apprehend, what he's talking about when he talks about community. It's potent and powerful and foreign to me. Mm-hmm. Like, in a way, like there's a memory somewhere back there. Yeah. But it's not how I've lived. It's not how I've lived. I remember, the memories I have mostly are, I think about my grandparents, and their farm. and going to visit them and being with them. And there's like that, the memory of them connects with what I read in these books about Port William. And so there's like a thread there that I feel like I can apprehend from experience that's there. But it gets so fleshed out in the books that he writes. And he's such an incredibly lovely writer, and his use of words is sublime. And he just creates an experience of understanding what community really means, not in a much more depth, like in a depth that it conveyed to me what that word means in a way that I didn't understand before reading his work at all. No idea.
Yeah, I'm reading The Memory of Old Jack right now, and it's the first novel I read of his, and I agree with what you said so far. I think he's a beautiful writer, and oftentimes I have to dwell on a passage for a little while to make sure that I grok it, what he's getting at. Then, the first book I've read of his was The Unsettling of America, which I think is how a lot of people get into it. But I want to connect this, and I promise you we're going to get into psychedelics soon, but I want to connect this to how you approach psychotherapy, but then kind of Wendell Berry's critique in The Unsettling of America of, how much, by basically, industrializing, specializing so much, becoming uprooted from the land, disconnected from the land. He just, he talks about how that affects our culture and how that affects our psychology. So how do you think about your practice? Like, 'cause you're not just dealing with the person, you're dealing with the person in their context, and you're dealing with the person in a context of a culture that, has, become just really kind of, ungrounded from, the primary things, right? In many ways. And so I'm wondering, how do you think about, do you get what I'm asking? Like this connection between his critique of culture, modern culture, and what it's doing to our psychology, and how do you, like, are those separate things that you're in the office and you're just dealing with the person, like, or how do you think about it?
No, they're not separate. Nothing separate. It's a good question because it's, I view myself as a contextualist. That's sort of how I think of myself, professionally. I practice, contextual behavioral science is sort of the acceptance commitment therapy is the therapy I practice, which is stems from contextual behavioral science. And, so as the name implies, everything is in context. You can't just isolate and reduce a single, aspect of a person's life without also considering, the full context. And that is the full context, is that we are, generally speaking, a culture that's isolated from each other and isolated from our place. We're like these sort of like, I don't want to, disembodied is the word that comes to my mind. And I guess that's maybe not inaccurate. Yeah. Pardon?
The word commodified came to my mind. We've all become commodified.
Yeah, commodified, disembodied, like we're just separate. There's this massive separateness. And so that is the context, in which I'm doing therapy with a lot of people. So it isn't just like, hey, tell me. Another context, I guess, that's important to note too, is then there's this view of what mental illness is. Like it's this brain chemistry bullshit, for lack of a better term. That's a perfect term, actually. It's perfect. Because it is. It's just like we're just, our brains are a little out of whack. And we meme online with the brain chemicals dialed in.
Have you seen the meme online where there's like a forest that's been cut down and there's this little baby koala like shivering on the tree stump, and you have these like these therapists or doctors or whatever. You know what I'm talking about.
I do. I saw it just today. Today it came through. I saw it.
And what I forget what
exactly
what it said in the caption. It's something like, this koala seems to have some kind of mental illness, right? But it's like Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
you just cut down its forest and its habitat and everything that it ascribes meaning to.
exactly. And so like you lose your entire sort of ecological niche, or you lose your um, your family, and it's normal, completely normal to you go off to college, you move with 100 miles, you move all we're just all over the place, because that's just the way it is, and that's just the way you do things. But we have failed to stop and think about what that means. What it means to not have roots, what it means to not have connection. For me, it has always been. I've always been connected to where I've lived physically. I was blessed to grow up in this place. My parents raised me in this place they built, carved out, when I was 6, they carved a little clearing out of the woods and built their own house, by hand. And we grew up in this place, and it's beautiful. And over the course of the next, 30 years, put in these beautiful gardens and built a pond, and it just made this beautiful little oasis in Southern Illinois. It's absolutely jewel of a place. And, it's where we grew up, and it's lovely. And so we were all, me and my siblings, just really connected there, grounded there. And it was always sort of it always felt like home. And then, moved up here 10 years ago. And now what's happened is my sister, she ended up moving close to us. She lives over in the nearby town now. She moved because she was in Colorado as well. And she moved, she lives about 30 minutes. And then my parents actually sold that place, and they moved up here. And so my brother doesn't, but the rest of my family, we all live pretty close and are kind of putting roots down to this place. And for me, it's really central to obviously the farm I live on. Being in a relationship with the place is really, really important. What's harder for me is being in a relationship with community. It really is a thing that is, it does not come natural to me.
Yeah.
But I digressed, I think, from the initial question, which was about practicing therapy, and just the context of that. But it ties back into, I think everyone needs that. We need connection. We need connection to other people. We do need a connection to a place. We do need a connection to community. You can't just yank a person out of everything they know and put them somewhere else and expect them to be fine. These relationships, these networks, these ways of making meaning of the world around us are kind of fragile, actually. And I think it's easy to not appreciate how. I think that's a big part, tying it back, like, of when I went to college, what was so hard for me. I think that's maybe why you see a lot in college kids going absolutely ape shit, is because they're completely removed from their context and thrown into this brand, like, and it's just, okay, I guess we're partying now. Like,
yeah,
I don't know what the fuck is going on. Let's drink. It's just like a really crazy thing to do to kids, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump into psychedelics conversation. I know you tweeted about it today, and it seems like there's a lot of interest. So I guess I want to start with, coming from, we can talk about scientific studies. Like John Hopkins, I know, is a big player in this, of like, how psilocybin studies have made people, have been transformative in their lives. But from your kind of experience actually using psychedelics, or your experience in, observing others, like what is it about the internal experience of, these drugs, medicines, however you want to frame it, what is it about that internal experience? Like, can you take me through some of the phenomenology of it? Like what is actually happening?
Sure. So before we start, I feel like I have to do this should not be taken as medical advice. I'm a counselor, but I'm not your counselor. Mm-hmm. Unless I am, and you're listening to this, and then we can talk about it next week if you like. We can discuss this interview, but no, if you're listening, This isn't medical advice at all. And so the word that is commonly used for intense experience is ineffable. So it's hard to put words to sometimes. But I think that it varies a lot by dose and what substance you're using. And I think what I want to say about it is it's probably unlike, if you haven't done it, it's probably unlike just about any other experience you've had before. In that my view of it is, I think what it does is it pretty much disables our language function. And if you've ever used it, that's why people describe it as ineffable, I think. And if you've ever used it, you've kind of had that experience of like words just don't do the same thing that they do as you and I are exchanging them right now, where you kind of understand the meanings of them. And we exchange these symbols and know how to communicate with each other. We know what they mean. We know what they refer to. And we can make sense verbally of things around us. That ability is frayed to the breaking point under the use of heavier doses of psychedelic drugs. And I think personally, that's what I think is the most interesting part of it. Is, we lose that verbal capacity or mostly lose it. And then I refer to them, the word I like to use, or the phrase I like to use, is conceptual solvents, because as they break apart that our normal way that we conceptualize the world, because that's verbally is how we have this whole learning history from the time we start using words, and everything we remember is all constructed through this symbolic network. Well, when that goes away, we're sort of left without the concepts that we normally view the world through, right? So everything we see and do is filtered through what we expect to a certain degree, and what we expect is constructed by the words that we have been exposed to, and the phrases and the way that we understand things. And when that's all gone, you're left with only direct experience, just the direct experience of sitting there and listening to music or seeing something. And that direct experience, I think, is, like unmediated by our normal conceptual sense. I think there's a lot of power there to see the world directly, to see ourselves directly, without being filtered through our ideas of who we are, of what we're good at, what we're not good at, where we fail, that's all temporarily taken offline. And we just directly see, just this kind of furry animal, just this organism in this sort of weird world. And that experience, where we can just sort of like see and connect with the world as it is, not how we think it is, see and connect with ourselves as we are, not as we think they are, is powerfully transformative, or can be powerfully transformative.
Yeah. Can't help but throw in so Scratchy asked a question about kind of the localism question with regards to psychedelics. So traditionally, in various cultures, we know that various cultures use psychedelics, but local, substances, local plants, mushrooms, various things, and they were incorporated within the ceremonial and religious structure of the culture of the society. My early exposure to it was in that context. It was in kind of a ceremonial context. And so I guess let me just throw out kind of my apprehension, because I have used psychedelics. I'm not a stranger to psychedelics. I haven't used a lot, but I have used some. In that, in a decontextualized, disembedded society, where, and in a postmodern society, where kind of traditional notions of ascribing value have already been frayed, right, and warped and mixed up. I guess I'm asking this question because I know of somebody who used psychedelics and then ended up doing a very, very bad thing. Basically, he went nuts. His whole notion of time, his whole notion of good and bad morality got frayed, ended up doing a very bad thing. And so I'm just wondering, I guess my question is, what is the role of set and setting, right? What is the role of context? What is the role, or what needs to be the role of, so we're kind of dropping concepts, we're becoming unfiltered, we're seeing things as they are. But ideally we're trying to do that to kind of get out the clutter, to get out the, there's what term am I looking for? The maladaptive kind of ideas of ourselves, clear those out so we can get more, let's just say, adaptive or joyful, however we want to think about it, context. But, what needs to be there for that, ideal process to happen and not for it to go off the rails?
Well, that's a really important question. I think that's like the question. Yeah. To put a little historical context to it, so psychedelics first sort of explode, in the West, they've been used, they were kind of used throughout the 40s and 50s by like the, elite intelligentsia, things, like that, like Aldous Huxley, and they began to be used by, in psychiatry, because if you're interested in the mind, you're probably going to be interested in psychedelics. It's just fascinating. Yeah. So it was used in those settings. And then, the kind of Pandora's box was open, cat got out of the bag, however you want to say it, in the 60s, they just kind of exploded into culture, like exploded. And there was a lot of fallout from that, good and bad. I think there were a lot of good things that happened from that. Clearly a lot of bad things that happened from that too, just sort of like this, explosion of use and completely decontextualized. You said there weren't containers for it. Nobody knew anything about this. Like that book, like I mentioned earlier, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test is a fantastic book to read about just the sheer, insanity of that period. Yeah. It was nuts. And to me, it's kind of a wonder that more bad stuff didn't happen, to be honest. To me, that speaks because it was so just like, I don't know, let's see what happens. Let's just lots of people just do this and just see what happens. And so in a way, I think it's very interesting that more bad stuff didn't happen, but absolutely stuff did and continues to. And it shouldn't be presented as, and I don't present it as like a perfectly safe run of the mill thing. It's an interesting, it's very interesting that most psychedelics, the big ones, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, are like physically non-toxic, basically non-toxic. You pretty much can't overdose on them. And that if your body can be kept safe, for that period of time, you're going to be okay physically. Now psychologically and mentally, I don't think you can make the same claim that they're perfectly, you cannot make the same claim that they're perfectly safe, but physically there's some lingering perceptual issues that can happen. I guess you would put that sort of blurs the line of what's, physiological, psychological, whatever. So there are some perceptual issues that can linger, for sure. But you're not going to overdose. Mm-hmm. But again, that doesn't imply that the experience is completely safe, because it can be completely disorienting, and it can open up a person to bad trips. And when I say bad trips, that kind of sounds like a cute little phrase, bad trip, but it's, it can be like a completely horrific experience of complete loss of experience of loss of everything. You can experience dying, what it would be like to die. You can experience, but the thing is, when it's a bad trip, you kind of lose that reference point of like, okay, I took a drug and now I'm experiencing dying. Like, it's just, you're dying and you're experiencing that, or you're experiencing the loss of, like, you have these experiences that are deeply painful and you lose track of why you're having them. And there's, one of the things, a hallmark of how psychedelics behave is they distort your sense of time. So you feel like you're having these horrible experiences and you're caught in this time loop, and they're never, like, it's infinite. So you're basically infinitely caught in a horrible experience is your experience of that. Like, this is it, and this is all there is, and this is all there's ever going to be. Yeah. Truly bad. So and that's an obvious risk. You're also very vulnerable, when you're taking psychedelics. So, speaking to set, and setting, I mean, if you're not careful, if you don't know the people you're with, if the people you're with aren't trustworthy, you can be very, very taken advantage of. And there are lots of stories about that. People who are taken advantage of. And I think that there are, there's also risks of, I don't know how to say it exactly, but I think there's worldview risks too. Like, if it's something that can change so profoundly the way you see the world. Like for me, that happened, as I mentioned at the beginning, in a very positive way. I was able to see pretty clearly what was important to me, and respond to that. And it was really good for me in my life. But if it's something that can change and shift your worldview so much, there's no guarantee it's going to do that in a direction that's positive.
Right.
And so I think that's a risk too. So like, there's these worldview shaking things that I think is very shaped by the setting in which you use them, both in terms of your own internal setting, the people you're around, what you've been exposed to. That's why everybody wears tie-dye, right? It's not because like there's a tie-dye part region of your brain. It's because that's what happened in the 60s. And so that became associated with it. So it became associated with this sort of left-wing sort of hippie movement kind of. And so a lot of those things that we associate with psychedelics are artifacts of the basically original cultural context for it. Yeah. But I don't think that's inherent to the psychedelic at all. I just think that that's associated culturally with psychedelic use. And it could be associated with something else.
Let me just take it. This might take us kind of off track, but it's kind of a question that I like to muse over. Like, do you draw a sharp distinction between phenomenology and metaphysics? What I mean by that is, like, you were talking about how, you can go into these heaven realms or you can go into these hell realms, and I've experienced both psychedelics. And you can feel like you're seeing reality for how it really is, and you're waking up, and this is actually the real reality. This heaven realm or this hell realm is actually real, and everything else is a mirage. Do you see that, mostly as just a kind of a epiphenomenon of the brain, and or do you see that we're actually tapping into some deeper fabric of reality? Did you have religious views on this?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think the answer is both. There's a lot of epiphenomenon that is just like, like curly cues and, and they're clearly just perceptual distortions, not true hallucinations, but just like distortions in your perception. There is that I don't ascribe any deeper meaning to that. But, as far as my own spiritual beliefs, man, they are, a person I consider kind of a mentor of mine. He used to describe himself as spiritually as densely ambiguous, which I relate to very much. I will say that before I ever used psychedelics, I was very much a materialist atheist. I grew up in Southern Illinois and I was like the non-Christian around. And so that hardened me off a little bit as well, like, kind of made me doubled down on that aspect of my personality and that aspect of the way I saw the world, and was sort of antagonistic and whatnot. And then, you know, after my experiences with psychedelics, I was definitely like, well, I am not an atheist anymore. I don't know what the hell I am, but I'm not that. Because clearly there's way the fuck more here than I had any idea. And since then,
is the elephant in the room.
Yeah, that's like putting that together and making sense of that.
The fact that we can't really explain consciousness, and you know, sorry to get you off track, but
no, not at all.
I remember the last time I was on psychedelic, and this happened a couple times where you like look at yourself in the mirror, and you have like, I guess I would call it an idealist experience, idealism in kind of the philosophical sense of like, wow, like there's just this kind of like body, and I usually just kind of associate it with me, but now that, you know, the sense of self is kind of dissolved, there's just like this consciousness happening, and then there's like this physicality, but like it's all within consciousness, right? Like that kind of that kind of sense. Anyway,
mirror trip. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, not at all.
I feel like I'm cutting you off. I just, you know.
No, I don't feel that way at all. It's, you know, the more conversational, the better, because I can go off on tangents myself. So feel free. But that's a great, and you know, you see there are a lot of opinions on that question. And it's, you know, an interesting thing to me is, so, you know, in the 60s when this happened, there was like a pretty significant pipeline, you know, like a hippie to Buddhist pipeline, like this big, you know, psychedelic to Buddhist pipeline. And I think part of that was because so much of that era was a rejection of, you know, the values of it was a counterculture. So it was a rejection of the cultural values that brought the kids, because this was mostly young people, to that moment. You know, part of that was was Christianity, like that was associated with the whole thing. So it's like, well, I'm not going to explore that. And so there was an exploration of, you know, Eastern traditions, particular Buddhism, and there are some wonderful language. There's a lot of wonderful language and practice in Buddhism that lends itself well to making sense of psychedelic experience. And there's a great book, Zigzag Zen, by a guy named Badner, who explores that, like, among Buddhists, among Buddhist practitioners, and leaders, about, well, is this a valuable way to get on the path? Is this a valuable way to practice? Is this a delusion that should be avoided? Is this, you know, and there's not a consensus view. There's a lot of different ideas about it.
Right.
One of the things I'm really interested in is, I think now, I get the sense that there is sort of like an emerging, what we might call like a right-wing counterculture now that didn't exist before, right? Like you alluded to that earlier, you know, with the, you know, the tubs of peanut butter and the you know, the organic food and all the crunchiness that my whole life was like, that was hippies, you know, and now it's like, oh, hey, hold on. Now this is trad. This is right-wing. It's really freaking disorienting, to be honest. But it also seems like there is, mixed up in this like new right counterculture stuff, there's also psychedelic use. I'm not saying everybody who's trad is like, not at all, but it seems like, okay, there's a good mix in here.
Yeah.
You know, and Joe Rogan, who is not a trad or a conservative in that sense, but is extremely influential, you know, and
he's
comes from
a theological line operator.
Right. And he's not a hippie, right?
Well,
he called him ideological.
He smokes joints on set while he's interviewing.
Yeah. Which would have definitely made him a hippie 20 years ago. Today, I'm not sure. You said ideological pipeline operator. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I just think people go down a lot of rabbit holes, or, you know, you talk about like the pipeline from like quirky urban hipster to reactionary trad cath or something, right? You know, there's just so many pipelines in the world, especially with the internet. And it just seems like a lot of people get to where they're going and they start out with Joe Rogan these days.
It does seem that way, right? And you know, and of course he's like the DMT guy, or I mean, in large part to a lot of people, I think he's like the DMT guy. But exposure, like way more exposure than just like fringe hippiedom, for sure, right? And so what I'm curious about too is, because I think a lot of, like I mentioned before, like the tie-dye, and I think the interest in Buddhism, like a lot of that is because that's what happened then in the late 60s, early 70s, is that was sort of what the cult, there was like this rejection of mainstream culture. And these are the sort of the cultural motifs and things that were picked up on. I'm curious as, you know, as that changes and like what else is going to be brought in, or like what's going to happen if like a lot of, you know, a lot of Christians begin using, you know, psychedelics, and like how might that, you know, inform their practice, and how might that also inform the way that psychedelics are viewed? Because that's, I mean, I think that there's, like I said before, like I think there's a lot of really useful language in Buddhism to describe it. Well, there's also a lot of really useful, like I think there's a lot of congruence and depth, you know, within the Christian tradition as well. And I'm very curious how people, because I think there will be people, you know, who attempt to like build containers within that, you know, using using a Christian worldview and build and I think these containers kind of go back to a question you asked a few minutes ago, like what containers are we providing for people? One container is the therapeutic container, right? We're going to do this for mental health, right? You know, there are religious containers. There are no containers, like it just like use it. But I do think the context, the set and setting, and the set and setting refers to your mindset, basically what you bring into a trip, and also like who you're taking it with and in what environment you're taking it. Like these are all very important. So what containers are going to be built and who controls the containers is another really big and fascinating question.
So that relates to a question somebody else had, embryoscopy, something along the lines of, you know, is it a good thing that it's slowly, maybe inexorably, maybe not, being legalized and medicalized and capitalized? You know, what are the upsides and downsides of this in terms of containers?
Yeah, there's a lot of both. My preference personally is, I call it like an all of the above. So I am a supporter of decriminalization measures first and foremost, because I think that I value a person's sovereignty over their own mind and their own choices to do with their consciousness what they want. And I don't think putting people and incarcerating people for drugs is helpful on any level. Yeah. And so from a justice point of view, you know, I support decriminalization measures. Prohibition doesn't work. Repression doesn't work. We have lots of evidence that it doesn't work. It doesn't make things better. It's just a grave injustice that needs to be corrected. So there's that. I support therapeutic use, but the risk there, and it is a risk, it's a big risk. If it were done, and it goes through the FDA approval process, and so we have these medicines, right? They are medicines. You go to the doctor, you get prescribed. Well, then it's owned by our medical system, and that's bad because that's going to make it cost a shit ton of money, and go through this whole credentialism nightmare. And go through insurance companies, and then it's going to be done in a certain way, in a certain setting, with experts that haven't proven themselves to actually be able to help with mental health at all. I say this as a person in the field of mental health. We don't have a great track record, and psychiatry and mental health doesn't deserve to be the sole gatekeeper for this at all. I think that we're doing research, and I think that it can be helpful. And I am very bullish on the therapeutic use of psychedelics. I am I think is very, very good. But I also think it's very, very important that exclusive rights to dispensing psychedelics are not given to the medical therapeutic professions generally. They should not have the exclusive ability to use them. They should, like I said, do the research, go through the FDA approval process. I think it's very good. I think it can help a lot of people. But I think that has to be accompanied with decriminalization, which allows for people to be able to just, use it as they would. It allows for community use. It allows for religious use, which I think is pretty interesting. And actually, this is something that's springing up right now, especially in states that have like really powerful protections, like Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. States that have pretty potent religious freedom restoration acts, you're seeing like psychedelically oriented churches come up because, the language of the law is pretty clear, and the sacramental use of these seems pretty solidly protected. Now, if you add decrim in, like a decrim measure into that, it's that really paves the way for more ceremonial or religious use, which personally I'm the most bullish on. I think that building containers at a community level and being able to do it in groups with other people, as I talked at the very beginning, for me personally, I believe a theme of what I believe human beings need is connection, right? And so then if we can strip away, like I mentioned before, our conceptual boxes, and then we can connect with the place and with other people, and we can have that experience of deeper connection, right? Like, to me, that's what healing looks like. That's a very hopeful idea to me. And so religious use is actually where I'm most bullish, in community use and ceremonial use. Like I said, I do think I'm supportive of the mental health use. I don't know if I would use it in my practice or not. I'm not sure on that yet. But I'm really interested to see where it goes. And I think that if it's an all the above approach where we do decriminalization and we do, I support, there's mixed opinions on this too, but I support, sort of direct sale, like you'd be able to get it at some sort of a dispensary, because I think that disempowers black markets and whatnot. If somebody wants to go and they want to go to a concert, which concerts are interesting because concerts are a container that our culture has constructed for psychedelic use. Fish shows, dead shows, raves, these things are constructed to contain and to hold, and they actually do it remarkably well. It's amazing when you think about it, the number of people who can go and just like trip their absolute balls off with thousands of other people at a show, and they go in and they come out and everything's fine. That's sort of a remarkable thing, and have a good time together. It's kind of remarkable, I think. And that's sort of a construction, like a structure that's arisen to hold this use. And I think that that's happened with relatively little intention around it. So I think if we can, as a culture, bring a lot of intention to this, because I agree completely that it's really important that we construct containers with a lot of love and a lot of intention that hold people, with safety and with respect, so they can have an experience, but they can come out of it not completely disoriented and not completely lost, and getting the support that they need to sort of like, put things back together. And whether that context is, I hope there are contexts for people, either they're Buddhist and they want to go to a Buddhist context because that's their beliefs. If they want to go into a Christian context because they're Christian, they want that Christianity to be supported in that context. I hope there are different contexts that people can go and do this, where they can have their, because I don't think that what we're talking about here is like a deconstruction of all, somebody's values and a reprogramming from the bottom up. It's helping people just connect with everything that experience of conceptual solvent, like I said, that when it comes back, you come back the next day, you remember who you are, there are like really bad trips that continue to go on for a while, but the vast majority of people, you come back You know, it's like, well, how do I integrate what I saw, what I experienced into this? Like, there's this big jarring divide between, well, here's what I thought my life was, but here's what I experienced. How do I reconcile these things? And that reconciliation or integration, I think, is where a lot of really important work happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think about a question about how to connect this to kind of the common themes in Doomer optimism, you know, around localism, around ecology, regenerative, you know, agriculture. Do you see a connection? I mean, like you mentioned, deeper connections, and so one hope would be that we, you know, have a deeper connection with nature and with other people and people close to us. So, community, you know, deeper connection with nature. Is that kind of how you see kind of DO themed conversations and psychedelic themed conversations? These are two pretty different worlds. There's this little bit of overlap. A few people in DO are kind of interested in this stuff, but they're really different worlds. Is this where you see kind of the overlap happening?
I think so. I mean, to me, connection is very central to that. And you know, one thing that in conversations, you know, we have within Doomer optimism that comes up again and again and again is this theme of abstraction. You know, is this theme of like these, like we live in this world of massive abstraction all of the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what this conceptual solvent does. It just sort of like gives you an experience without all that, just like melts that away for a minute so that you can directly connect with, you know, and this is why, you know, in the 60s, a lot of the, you know, like I said, like a lot of the peripheral stuff with hippiedom, right? I think like the, you know, like the tie-dye and the, and all the stereotypes you have, you know, that's just sort of like, I think kind of like randomly what just happened to people selected. But there are a lot of values that came from that I think are not psychedelic values exactly, but I think they came from, hey, if we remove abstraction and we focus on like, I mean, stereotype, but like, hey, what about this universal love thing? You know, like what about this idea that we're connected with each other? You know, what about this idea that this planet that we live on is beautiful and we need to take care of it? You know, like what, like the food that we put in our bodies matters. Like how it was grown matters. How we nourish ourselves matters. Like a lot of this stuff comes directly from you remove these layers of abstraction and you directly experience what it is to be an organism. You know, like a organism on this earth, connecting with other organisms and just being. You know, I think a lot comes from that. A lot of these values that I think, you know, you saw a lot with the hippies, and I think you see it in this sort of like counterculture thing that I don't know what to make of exactly yet, you know. But there are this like, hey, there's deeper things here that aren't, you know, abstractions, that aren't these things that we've sort of like made up and created that are genuinely connected to what it means to be a human, you know, and we can connect to those. I think that's the power of the site is it removes, it's not so much what it plants as what it removes. You know, it doesn't implant ideas, it removes impediments.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but I want to give you a chance to, there's a few questions that people asked. If any of those questions were interesting to you and you want to respond to those, or if there's, you know, anything else that you want to express before we wrap up.
Yeah, there were a lot of questions. I guess what I would say, you know, about that is I would love to answer a lot of them. So if anybody out there has any other questions, you know, message me. I've been meaning to write again a little more, so maybe I could dust off and do like a, you know, answer questions and spend a little more time writing about it if people had specific questions that we weren't able to get to, because like I said, I've been kind of looking for opportunities and reasons to spread my thinking out longer than tweet length a little bit more.
Yeah.
But I think that, it's not, I guess I would like to say something just about the drug thing. People have a lot of preconceptions, a lot of fear, and a lot of judgment around drugs and drug use. And I get it. Almost everybody, I'm sure, knows somebody who's been harmed by it. I don't think very many people know people that haven't been, anywhere from,
drugs or harmed by psychedelics specifically.
Drugs. I don't think everybody knows somebody who's been harmed by psychedelics, but I think a lot of people don't really differentiate, like drugs are drugs, and psychedelics are a specific kind of drug. I'll own for sure. I think that drugs should be decriminalized generally. I don't think the drug war works, and I think it's inhumane. So when I say this, I'm not saying this because psychedelics are okay, but these other drugs are bad and awful, and those people should be punished. I'm not going to say that. I think the drug war should be ended because it's inhumane and it doesn't work. And I think the drug abuse does cause pain. And I think that psychedelic use specifically can be dangerous. It's not like take this, it's harmless. You'll see God, it'll be great. Everything will be wonderful. It's serious stuff. It's powerful stuff. And I think the more but I also think you can't, even if we wanted to, you can't put the cat back in the bag on this one. It's out, it's in our culture. We need to understand it. I think it can be helpful to a lot of people. I think that if we do it with a lot of intention, it can be helpful to us as a society, as a culture. I very much think that it could be. I'm not saying that I think it will be. I don't know, but it could be. But we need to be careful with them, and we need to take a lot of care with them. And I understand that people have skepticism and they have fear and they think that it's something that, and if you don't want to use them, don't use them by all means. They're not necessary. But for purposes of healing or for growth, many people have found them to be, extremely helpful. And I think they offer a lot. But I do think we need to individually and collectively take a lot of care with them because they're really potent. They're very powerful things. I feel a lot of times like I was very fortunate because I was just, like I mentioned at the beginning, like a dumb kid that just happened along these things. I had no idea, no concept. I quickly became really fascinated enough. I started reading everything I could get my hands on pretty quickly. This isn't booze. This isn't pot. This is whoa. I was fascinated. And it was interesting to me that it was just sort of like we sort of spontaneously generated our own container for it. That became a pretty secure and workable container.
Yeah.
And it did contain and guide us to some interesting and profitable places for sure. And that was spontaneous. So that influences my thinking a lot too, is that just, we just gave it space and it just sort of happened. I didn't have intention behind that at all. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
I could probably just keep going. So it's, I like to talk about this stuff a lot. As you can tell, it always has been, I've always, like I said, I've kind of had, when I had my experiences as a young man and they changed my life positively, and I can't deny that. I never could deny that. And I felt since then, integrity bound to be loyal to that experience and be honest with it. And so I've, in all settings, all the time for 25 years, I talk about psychedelics, even when it was pretty not probably advisable. But I've just always felt like, hey, this happened. This was good.
Right.
This helped me. And it's bullshit that we're putting people in jail for it. And, it's bullshit that we're not trying to understand this better. because this is my experience and I have to own it.
Right. I want to throw in kind of an experience I've had that I think it would be also something that if they were interested in this stuff that I would recommend is to pair it with some kind of practice. So I'm definitely of the mind that it probably should be in some kind of spiritual religious container. And that can be pretty informal. It can be a group of friends who set some clear intentions and things of that nature. I found that I had, so I got really interested in consciousness and I got really interested in meditation. And I was doing a lot of meditation for a while. And I had already taken psychedelics. And then I had one experience where I had taken something and I just got, one, in some ways, I felt like I was better able to handle it in the sense of, sometimes prior I had gone down these rabbit holes of paranoia, like this kind of radical existential paranoia. And I had felt that my kind of meditation training allowed me to kind of stabilize myself to some degree, not always successfully, but to some degree to basically have the best experience with it that I could. Like it kind of gave me a ground that even though I was having these phenomenal experiences, extraordinary experiences, it wasn't so disconnected with a trajectory that I was already on that it would become that it became scary or frightening all of a sudden because it was just so. And so I guess I guess that's all to say that I think that having some kind of spiritual or religious practice is generally a good thing. I actually recommend it for people. For me it is meditation, but and prayer. I do both, and that's really this conversation comes up a lot. You talked about like psychedelics in the Buddhist community, and the conversation a lot there is, psychedelics is, you get up to the top of the mountain right away, but you don't stay there, right? And so, but it can help guide your direction, right? And so really you want to be, continually growing, having these insightful experiences, and psychedelics being kind of, a helpful guide occasionally. But, that's a, contrasted with just taking psychedelics or just doing something else. And so I guess that's my own point of view on that is that as much as possible, pair it with, a dedicated practice of some kind. And for me, ideally, you're already in that dedicated practice before you even get started. Although sometimes taking psychedelics will get you on that practice as well. And so it doesn't always need to work out that way. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. I don't know if you on that.
Yeah, that's like it's a pipeline for sure in both directions. But I think that's it is that reconciliation between like the mountaintop and like where you are before you ever took it, and like, oh, these are far apart. And I think that's and people often say, which I really object to the notion that it's like, well, it's a shortcut. Well, I mean, kind of, but not really, because you don't get there. You just see it. Like the work is still in this reconciliation, like between like, yes, exactly. It's okay. You've had a glimpse. It can really orient you towards, really recapturing and reconnecting with what you value, with what you love, with what you care about. Right. But that doesn't solve anything. It just gives you a compass bearing, and right, like you've got to walk it, like you've got to do that still. It can help you see where your path lies, but it doesn't. You still have to travel it. So I don't view it as a shortcut at all. If it's done properly, because I think and this is where I think it can't, there's a million, there are perils, right? Like there's tremendous perils, like, and people, talked about this in the thread. And I think people see this a lot, is like that, that you take it and then you think you understand something, right? And you maybe take it a few times, you really think you've got it, or you're enlightened or whatever. Yeah. And you're not. And I think that's part of what that container has to really be there to provide. Is like, well, you saw some really important things. Mm-hmm. But you're also here right now. Right. And nothing's really different than was before. You still have to live your life in this way.
Programming hasn't, embodied programming, mental patterns hasn't necessarily caught up with that one peak experience.
Not at all. Not at all. And I think that aligning those.
This is a similar thing with, people who do like intensive meditation retreats, right? For like 10 days or 30, it's kind of a similar thing. It's like, yeah, a lot, sitting quietly for 10 days straight with little sleep is going to break some things down, and you're going to have some experiences. But, integrating that into your everyday life, it almost calls you to some kind of path of commitment, to commit to something, right? Commit to it. And, I don't want to get too lean on the religious. I think religious setting is, our ancestry, right? That was, I think, mostly the original context was in a religious setting. But, it might be redevoting yourself to your family or to your community or whatever. And that's fine too.
Or a piece of land, right? Like there was a reason that the hippies were like back to the land.
Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty direct reason for that.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Nate, this was fun.
Very, very fun.
Cool, man. Any last words?
Well, just we didn't get, and I didn't really intend to. So there are a lot of people asking about it, and I really didn't intend to get too into the like how to stuff, because
that might be a good thing to follow up with you on in a DM, maybe.
Sure. And there's a lot out there, and I'm not, like I said, it's not medical advice, and I'm not advising anybody to do this. I want people to understand, and I want people to learn more. And if you feel moved that you want to try it, like, okay, like continue to learn more. Consider this like a curiosity on ramp if it grabs you that way. But by no means is this, like a how-to session for like how you should go about doing it. I think there is, a lot of intention and care to be put into it. If you want more information, there's a lot of places to find it. Again, my podcast, Altered States of Context, I do with my podcast partner, Dr. Brian Pilecki, and we explore a lot more medically and from a psychotherapeutic point of view, its use. And there's, a lot that you can look and find which episode is interesting to you. I kind of try to not use too much clinical language to make it accessible to the layperson. So that's a resource if anybody wants to use it. And also I'm on Twitter too much. And so feel free to hit me up. Yeah. That nickname was actually, the handle was born from this period of my life I described when I was kind of out of control. I went on a tear in the fraternity house I lived in. Like, it's such a fucking stereotype, but like, and the next day the janitor came through there and was like, man, it looks like a tornado came through here. And so then people started calling me Tornado Nate. That was my nickname. And then I had been sober for years because I didn't drink for about 15 years. And then when I made my Twitter handle, I was just at a point in my life where I'm like, you know what? I don't want the pathology of that energy, but there's something about that energy that's pretty like me. Yeah. And so like I want to own that part without the, drunken destruction.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think anyone who's familiar with your Twitter personality, like Tornado Nate, yeah, yep.
Yeah, it felt right. It felt right.
Yeah, cool, man. This is great. I'll see you. I'll see you later. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Thanks.